Good evening. My name is Lucas Swenson. I'm from Howard Lake, Minnesota. I'm studying political economy and German here at Hillsdale, and I'm a sophomore. And today, I have the pleasure of introducing Arthur Herman, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He is a professor, he has been a professor of history at Georgetown University, Catholic University, George Mason University, and the University of the South. He writes regularly for Commentary, Foreign Policy, The American Interest, Mosaic, Nikkei Asian Review, and the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of several books, including Gandhi and Churchill, the epic rivalry that destroyed an empire and forged our age, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2009, Douglas MacArthur, American Warrior, and the forthcoming 1917, Lenin, Wilson, and the Birth of the New World Disorder. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Arthur Herman.
How are you? It's good to see you. I should say welcome to Hillsdale College, but a lot of you are already here. You know the place. This is actually my first visit. I've spoken, had the pleasure and the privilege of speaking at Hillsdale College cruises twice, which I've enjoyed very much. And so when Larry Arnn said, we want you to come and speak to our Center on Constructive Alternatives about part of the subject, one half of your new book, 1970, his What Lenin Hath Wrought over the last 100 years. And 1917, of course, is the watershed date when he becomes a world historical figure. And I also want to talk about Lenin's legacy, and I want to be sure to save some time to talk about that. What I want to do in the first part of my lecture, however, is to dispel some myths about Lenin, myths which were very prevalent when I went to college, which was shortly after the Civil War. Myths that were very prevalent and are still very prevalent in our colleges and universities today. I want to talk to you about that. And which I think have kind of glossed over who Lenin really was and what his real legacy was right up until today. Three myths I want to dispel. The first is that the legend that he is the father of the Russian Revolution. As you're going to find out, he's not. He cashes in on the Russian Revolution, but he's not the father of it. The real revolution takes place when he's hundreds of miles away from the events and even ignorant of what happens until after it's over. The second myth I'm going to dispel is that Lenin was a disciple of Karl Marx and of Marxism. Yeah, I know. I just saw some faces fall, including by leading scholars in it, but I'm going to explain that too, that Lenin comes from a very different world and a very different way of understanding how human history works and what takes place, and that has a huge impact on the legacy he's going to have later on. The third myth I'm going to dispel is the myth that Lenin was better than his successors. That, in other words, that he was really a good guy who, if it hadn't been for a series of strokes that debilitated him in 1923 and then finally killed him in January 1924, that the direction he would have taken the Soviet Union and communism would have been very different from that of Joseph Stalin, and that if he had lived, that the legacy of communism would be very different from what it is today. That, again, is a myth that was very prevalent and still is very prevalent, and a number of very prodigious and prestigious scholars in some of our leading universities have built their careers examining what if Lenin had lived, what if Stalin had never come to power. I'm going to finish that off once and for all. But before I get going, let's take a quick look. Let's think about Lenin as a person for a moment. Think about him as someone in his real time and place. Born in 1870 in the town of Smirbirsk in central Russia. This is not someone who came from the kind of polished, rising bourgeois world of St. Petersburg and Moscow, someone who grew up in a kind of environment in which there was a sort of rising sense of Russia becoming part of, embracing Western ideas, of becoming part of a larger Europe. I talk about this in my new books. I won't go into all the detail. What we have to remember about Lenin is that he comes from basically a rough and tumble frontier town, a town that sits on the border between Russia and what had been the Tatar Empire, the empire of Tamerlane, that his grandmother, in fact, was a Tatar woman. He grew up in an area of constant ethnic conflict, of a kind of latent violence, sort of the Russian Wild West. And so for Lenin, the world of enlightenment and of ideas and so on is really, in a sense, something that's superimposed upon a world in which he grew up, in which his family had heritage was based upon. His father was a Russian civil servant, very prestigious, someone with very successful. He was a state inspector of schools. His mother came from a very comfortable family. The great tragedy that shattered that family, however, came in 1887, when his beloved elder brother, Alexei Ulyanov, because that's the family name, he's born Vladimir Ulyanov. Lenin is a revolutionary pseudonym assumed later on during his career as a revolutionary and conspirator. When his elder brother, Alexei Ulyanov, is found guilty of being involved in a plot to assassinate the Tsar and is executed. Destroys the family, destroys them. And for young Vladimir, the experience is a watershed in the sense that, not in the sense that he wasn't already radicalized, and we know this from evidence that he'd already been exposed to some radical ideas. Whether they were Marxist or not, we don't know. We don't know. But he was certainly moving in that kind of a direction. But the execution of his brother proved to him, in his mind anyway, that the only way in which Russia was really going to change, and was going to change for the better, was through violence. That violence was the answer, that what his brother and his handful of hapless conspirators had tried to do needed to simply be better organized and carried out in a more direct and a more efficient manner. And so he becomes a revolutionary. He becomes a revolutionary, becomes someone who's going to spend almost 3 decades either doing a spot of bird in Siberia, as the British would say, or, on the other hand, being in exile in foreign countries and traveling around, avoiding secret police and the other kinds of threats, including from other revolutionaries that he was constantly exposed to. And this is one of the things that I want you to understand about Lenin. Lenin the exile, Lenin the man on the run, is that for him, the real battle, the battle he's engaged in on a daily, weekly basis, in his articles, in his meetings, in his discussions, and his forming his band of conspirators, isn't against the Tsar or the Tsarist police. They turn out to be unbelievably inept in terms of their being able to deal with the threat that goes with the exile groups. It's with his fellow revolutionaries, with the fellow radicals he's dealing with, and his deep and abiding desire to emerge on top. But this is the driving thing for Lenin, is a confidence and a belief that he's got the answer, he knows how this is going to be done, and in the face of every frustration, in the face of every defeat, he keeps coming back because he is convinced that he knows the answer to what is coming and what's going to take place, which is unleashing the power of class war. And I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to that when I talk about the myths. That's when I come back to the second myth. But let's go forward and think about the first of the myths that we have to dispel. especially in the shadow of the centenary of the Russian Revolution of October according to the old Russian calendar, actually November according to the Gregorian calendar. And this is the myth that surrounds him as being sort of the figurehead of the Russian Revolution, what takes place, what happens here, presenting him as the great revolutionary leader. It's not a truth of it. The real revolution, the real Russian Revolution, had taken place months before the Russian Revolution that Lenin leads. It takes place in March, when the masses, the crowds in the capital of Russia, Petrograd, had been renamed after the outbreak of World War I, because St. Petersburg, it was felt, was too German, too Germanized, and so it's renamed as Petrograd. When they simply get fed up with the whole incompetence and the whole breakdown that had taken place with the Tsarist government trying to mobilize for war, it was a complete disaster. And for the people, even living in the capital, food and the basic goods had become scarce, impossible to find. When they rise up spontaneously, there was no organization to it. There were groups who rise up to join and follow the masses who rise up in order to sort of say, we're fed up, we're done with this war, we're done with this government, we're done with the incompetence, we need a change. And so in March of 1917, a massive wave of spontaneous revolution sweeps through the capital at Petrograd, topples the Tsar, pushes him into abdicating, and creates a new government, a republican government led by a handful of men who were connected with the representative body that had been set up after the revolution of 1905, the Duma, basically Russia's parliament, which up until then had basically been a collection of figureheads, men who had been denied power by the Tsar and by his government, but now in the power vacuum step forward to take command, to hold power and to reshape Russia in a new direction, to move it in a new direction. And to begin the process then of trying to create a modern democratic Russia on the bones and the ruins of the old Tsarist imperialist Russia that the First World War had shattered and destroyed. Well, the commitment that government had and the fragile hold on power that it held in Petrograd and also in Moscow, but Russia was the kind of country in which whoever holds power in the capital holds power throughout the country. It doesn't matter what happens elsewhere. It's the capital that counts. The crowds, the streets, the riots, the scenes, that's the center of action. That's center stage for power in Russia in 1917. March 1917, the government that comes to power is committed to two things: to make a new Russia, a modern democratic one that can integrate with the West, and on the other side, committed to keeping Russia in the war against Germany and Austria, but mostly against Germany. That was their chief ally. And this was the commitment they had made as a way to unite Russia with its Western democratic allies. We're going to be a fellow democracy with you, and we're going to fight against the power, the forces of authoritarianism and tyranny embodied in Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. Well, while all this happens, the German high command is fascinated. Russia's falling into chaos, the capital in upheaval. And so they begin to consider an idea: how can we help this process forward of making Russia fall deeper and deeper into a state of chaos, into a deeper state of disorder? And then one of their ambassador in Switzerland has an idea. He said, I've got this guy over here in Zurich, this obscure 45-year-old who's been writing article after article about, radicalism and other kinds of things, and he's been involved with all this. What if we send him over there and get him to stir up the crowds and get things going and create some more sort of chaos? Maybe we can even drive Russia out of the war by spreading chaos. And so a deal is struck by which the Germans will transport Lenin and his followers from Zurich across what was for a Russian enemy territory, right through the heart of Germany and Austria, into neutral Sweden, and then across to to Russia in order to stir up trouble. And Lenin, it tells a lot about his character, by the way. He immediately says, yes, I'll do it. That his willingness to not only accept the help from his country's enemy, Germany, but also to receive money from them. I mean, he was getting his bank account set up. He was regularly being supplied with money for them to keep his revolutionary cause alive in Russia. Says a lot about what he believed was going to happen. He would, by any means necessary, you know that slogan, right? That's Lenin. I'm going to bring revolution. I'm going to bring revolution to Russia, and I don't care who helps me, even the hated Germans. You know, the worst of the worst from the point of view of a Marxist standpoint. Even the worst of the worst, I'll accept their help. I'll accept their connection. And so the deal is struck. And he and his family and his followers travel across in what comes to be called a sealed train. It wasn't a sealed train. The fact of the matter is the Germans just made sure that he didn't step off the platform and go talk to others about workers rising up to fight against the repressors and things like that, and they drop him off. And he arrives, therefore, at the Finland station in Petrograd on April 12th, 1917, in order to stir up trouble. No one, not even his own followers, thought he could actually achieve anything besides just be stirring up trouble. The German authorities wanted him to cause chaos. That's what they wanted. Chaos that would, in the end, drive Russia into a state of anarchy in which it could no longer sustain the war effort. Lenin's goal was very different. He wanted power. And his goal was to achieve power however it was going to happen. And he was the one person who believed he could. And through a series of strange missteps, through a combination of his own sheer fanatical willfulness and weakness on the part of the new, fragile, democratic government that had come into power, he was able to achieve that. Achieve not just power, but supreme power. And by November of the 6th and 7th, he's able to achieve it. He tried in July. A coup was attempted in order to topple the government, but it failed, especially when the newspapers leaked the information about his connections with the Germans. And the other Russians said, oh my God, this Lenin, he's a traitor. He's working for the Germans, our enemies in this war here. And he has to flee for the border, and he goes into hiding in Finland for a few months. But then again, the government loses control of the situation. Its hold on power is precarious. And Lenin, in October, realizes the time is ripe to try again. In fact, he probably would not have even tried again if it hadn't been for the support of one person, and that's Leon Trotsky. If anyone is responsible for the revolution that topples the Duma, the government, the provisional government that held power since March, the real Russian Revolution, it was Leon Trotsky. He's the one who mobilizes the troops. He's the one who mobilizes the sailors to march from Kronstadt naval base down to the Duma palace in order to force a change of government. Lenin simply cashes in, follows in the slipstream behind what Trotsky has achieved, but he manages to hold power. He manages to grab power in the process. So the real story behind Lenin, the real story behind Vladimir Lenin, is not the father revolution, but the destroyer of the Russian Revolution. He's the man who topples it through a coup d'etat at the top, in which he and his Bolshevik followers, including Trotsky and Stalin, seized power from a government which was too weak and too feeble, and we have to sort of say lacked the confidence to hold power in the face of those who were willing to use force and violence in order to grab it. Now that brings us to our second myth. The second myth is about that Lenin is in some ways a disciple of Marxism, or that Leninism, as it comes to be called, is an outgrowth or an offshoot of Marxism. Read a lot of the textbooks and they talk about this. Now, let's be clear. Lenin is heavily influenced by Marxist theory. His exposure to Marx's works have a huge impact on him and on his thinking and his radicalization. What's interesting, by the way, as I explain in the book, what's interesting about this is that while living in Russia, is that Lenin, and even in exile in Siberia, that Lenin has very little trouble getting hold of texts by Karl Marx while living in Tsarist Russia. This is one of the strange things about this, is that the Tsarist police, who of course were fiercely censorious of any kind of foreign writings, especially anything that could be viewed as subversive, were completely focused on writings by indigenous Russian socialists and agrarian revolutionaries. This was their focus on that. So Marx completely slipped past their radar screen. Gives you some idea how completely inept the Tsarist police were in many ways. That you can go ahead and read the Communist Manifesto, read Das Kapital, not at all difficult to get hold of, but anything by one of the, like Chernyevsky or any of the other Russian agrarian socialist revolutionaries, and so on. A copy of that is found in your briefcase or found in your rooms. Off to Siberia you go. There's no doubt Lenin's very much affected by Marx's ideas, and that it plays an important role in his thought. But his thought, Lenin's approach, is a break from Marx. Marx's idea, what is Marx's idea? Marx's idea is that the march of history is one leading to dictatorship of the proletariat. That the working class will take over the means of production and create a whole new classless society. That this is built into the fabric of history. As we would say, I suppose today, that it is encoded in the nature of history, that the working class will take over. And that they'll sort of say to themselves, one day they wake up and they'll sort of say, we're being exploited. These people are appropriating our work, our labor, our value is all being taken away, and they're using it, the capitalist class. Let's get rid of them. Let's overthrow them, and let's take control of our lives, take control of our society. Now, Marx had no doubt that the revolution that would ensue would be violent, that the revolution that ensued would be one in which lots of people would be killed. He was hoping a lot of capitalists would die. He had no doubts about this. You read Marx's work about, the future revolution, it's apocalyptic. He's got bodies hanging from lampposts and these other kinds of things. Clearly, it was something which he foresaw with great relish in the future. But this was in the future. In his own mind, the time that it would take, the way in which this would happen was that the working class would come to realize they'd been exposed. They'd read Karl Marx, they would read Friedrich Engels, they would come to understand their position in society, that is far from being the slaves of the capitalist production, they're the real masters. They've got to take control of the situation, and that the new society would arise. But this was in the future. This would take years, maybe even decades, even in the most advanced industrialized countries, because industrialization is what built a working class. Germany, Britain. This is a long way off before all this sort of thing happens. It's inevitable, it's coming, but it's a long way off. And the idea that it could happen in an unindustrialized country, even a country like Russia, for which Marx had enormous contempt as a country, as a society, as a culture. As he said about Russian peasants, he said, it's like a sack of potatoes. Each one is different, and yet they're all like. The idea that it's a country like this, which have, just beginning, had no real industrial revolution underway, could take place, that a revolution is ridiculous. Lenin's view is the opposite. It's precisely, at least industrialized countries, the one in which capitalism is just beginning to take shape here and beginning to shake the foundations of the traditional state and traditional institutions. That's precisely where a handful of men, a handful of dedicated men who understand power, who understand how they can seize power in the name of the working class and overthrow the existing institutions. That's the society in which the opportunity to create a dictatorship of the proletariat is most likely. The opportunity will be there. The opportunity, what we today call a failed state. Failed states is where power is waiting to be assumed by a revolutionary elite. For Lenin, that was Russia. Russia was a state in a state of collapse, especially after the war broke out, especially as the mobilization for war led to an increasing breakdown in Russian society and government's control over the provinces, even its control over the capital. Here is the moment in which a dedicated revolutionary elite can seize power and grab it. And what's the point of such an exercise? Is it to create a dictatorship of the proletariat? In Lenin's view, that's the phraseology, but his view expanded far greater than that. His view was that the result would be a massive uprising which would sweep Europe and sweep the globe as the working class and their leaders and their elite leadership would now rise up against the existing status quo and generate massive class war. And that's really the end game for Lenin. For Lenin, it is the unleashing of violence in all of its forms, in all of its directions, even in the name of national liberation, even in the name of national determination. This is what he had in mind. Here's a letter that he writes, and this is 17th of October, 1917, shortly before the Bolsheviks seized power. A letter he writes to his friend Alexander Shlepovnikov. The least bad thing that can happen in the short term would be the defeat of Tsarism in the war. The essence of our work, which must be persistent, systematic, and perhaps extremely long-term, he was wrong about that, it actually turned out to be less than a month, is to aim for the transformation of the war into a civil war. What will happen is another question, as is not yet clear. We must wait for the moment to ripen and systematically force it to ripen. Violence, civil war, war across the board. This is what his great goal, this is what his great aim is in what is unleashed and what's going to take place in his mind here. This is a very different view from Marx. For Marx, it's the unfolding of history that leads to these events. For Lenin, it's the unfolding of a revolutionary elite dedicated to the goal who will bring about violence and bring about the collapse of the existing society. What does Marx say? He says everything that exists deserves to be destroyed. Right? It's a quotation actually from the devil, from Mephistopheles, from Goethe's Faust. Lenin agreed, but he said, we don't have to wait for that. We can do it right now. And that's where we're going, and that's what we're going to do. And we can enlist the various movements of violence, the various movements that are involved and that we can take and assume in the process here that can take place. And this includes national liberation movements around the world, not just in Europe, but in colonial areas. As he says in one of his letters to his friends, he says, to imagine that social revolution is conceivable without revolts by small nations in the colonies and in Europe with all their prejudices is to repudiate the idea of social revolution. The Bolsheviks would be very poor revolutionaries if, in the proletariat's great war for liberation, for socialism, we do not know how to utilize every popular movement, whether it's outside Russia or whether it's in Ireland, the Easter Rebellion in 1916, in which all his fellow Bolsheviks were appalled at this. This is terrible. What are they doing? He loved it. He thought this was perfect. This is exactly the kinds of people he would want to enlist and involved with. A group like ISIS today, Lenin would embrace them. This is exactly the kind of group we need to be with. People who are creating chaos, people who are creating disorder. Because out of the failure, the collapse of existing institutions, we can seize power. We can grab what others have lost the grip on. When you think about Lenin versus Marx, believe me, Lenin becomes almost sort of a quaint thinker. It's like a real 19th century thinker, almost antiquated in his belief and his waiting for history to move the dials of events and the dials of human history forward. Lenin doesn't care where history's going. What he cares about is being on the right side of the gun. And that Mao's famous motto, right? Power comes from the barrel of a gun. Lenin never said it, but he's the one who believed it, and he's the one who put that idea into motion. And it's one which all of his great followers, especially in the world outside of Russia, will get embraced. Stalin less so. Stalin was very suspicious about third world nationalist and liberation movements. Even Mao made him very nervous. He was not happy, this Asiatic guy. He was not into it, and things like that. Lenin would have embraced Mao at once, realized this is my guy. This is the kind of person I want to be connected with. And that's why, by the way, one of his closest followers would become Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, who goes to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, right? in a rented tuxedo. He's working as a waiter. Did you know that? He was working as a waiter at one of the Paris hotels. And he goes to the conference in a rented tuxedo to talk about the rights of the Vietnamese people, you know. And of course, he's like pushed, you know, Wilson and the rest don't want to listen to this guy talk about these things. So he's deeply disappointed. He goes back to his small flat. And there he picks up, a year later, he picks up Lenin's, one of Lenin's seminal texts, by the way, which is his theses on the national and colonial questions, which is about precisely the ability of what we call the third world to unleash the forces of violence that will topple not just imperialism, but will topple the whole edifice on which bourgeois capitalism and democracy rests. And he reads them, and he says, this is Ho Chi Minh. I'm quoting Ho Chi Minh now in his memoirs. He says, Lenin's theses roused me to great emotion, great enthusiasm, great faith, and helped me to see the problem clearly. My joy was so great that at times I was reduced to tears. Alone in my room, I would cry out as though standing before a great crowd, my beloved, downtrodden, luckless compatriots, this is what we need. This is our road to freedom. After that, I put all of my trust in Lenin and the Third International. Vietnam, China, North Korea, they all spring not from Stalin, they spring from Lenin. Lenin is the source of that. Lenin is the source. He's the one who, like Osama bin Laden, comes to see failed states as the breeding ground for revolution, the breeding ground for class war and for transformation and all that takes place with that. So is Lenin a disciple of Marx? In an intellectual sense, in a genealogy of ideas way, yes, of course. There's no denying that. But Lenin's worldview is not a political philosophy. It's a program for revolutionary action. It's a program set up for translating violence into destroying an old order and creating a new order from it. Now, as for the nature of that new order, let's think about that for a second. Let's think about, and now we come to our third topic, and that is Lenin's order, if he had lived longer, would have descended into Stalin's tyranny. I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. Everything you know, if you read my book, if you read the steps he took immediately after the seizing power in November of 1917, you come to realize this is a man who has one thing on his mind, and that is to shed as much blood as possible in order to wipe away the old order, in order to create a new one which would be dominated by him and his party elite, by the Bolshevik party elite. There's no doubt about that at all. Every step of the way, the creation of a secret police, the creation of the original gulags, the creation of the Red Terror, all of these things spring not from Stalin. They don't even spring from Trotsky, who was in his own way a kind of revolutionary fanatic. They spring from Lenin and his whole approach to these subjects and what takes place. Let me just read to you, for example, a telegram he sent off to the Central Executive Committee. This is in 1918. This is less than a year after taking power. If you want to see the real Lenin, here's the real Lenin speaking to the Central Executive Committee of the Soviet in Penza. Comrades, the kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. For those of you who know, kulaks meant rich peasants, basically meant anyone who resisted the revolutionary and where the Bolsheviks were going. Anyone who did was counted now as a kulak. The interests of the whole revolution demand such actions, for the final struggle with the kulaks has now begun. You must make an example of these people. 1, hang publicly so people see it. At least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, and known bloodsuckers. 2, publish their names. Now, why would he say that? So their families are also then become targets. So their families also become targets for revolutionary revenge. 3, seize all of their grain, and I'll come back to that point in a second. 4, single out the hostages, per my instructions in yesterday's telegram. Do all this so that for miles around people see it all, understand it all, tremble, and tell themselves that we are killing the bloodthirsty kulaks and that we will continue to do so. And you don't want to be a kulak, is the basic rule with this, of course, unspoken. Reply, saying you have received and carry out these instructions, yours Lenin. P.S. Find tougher people. Those who are carrying out my orders aren't tough enough, aren't ruthless enough. We need those who are willing to do this without hesitation. So the old idea that I learned when I studied Russian history in college and so on, that somehow Lenin's death and his premature fall from power just 6 years after coming to power in November of 1917, that somehow this opened the door to Stalin to make things worse, to create a realm of terror. The realm of terror was already there. The reign of terror was already there under Lenin. Stalin, if anything, in many ways, regularized it, systematized it in a way in which, in Lenin's case, had sprung from a deep and abiding fascination with violence, a fascination with bloodshed, a fascination with the idea of a war that would spread from Russia across Europe and burn through the rest of the globe, through to every country and to every class in society through it. Now I want to finish up with the three legacies that I see from Lenin. And here I mean legacies that live on today, the legacies that we see today and that are part of Lenin's overall contribution, if that's the word for it, a contribution to making the world more chaotic and more horrible than one could imagine here. In fact, I think if only there's one single person who has done that in the broadest possible sense in the last 100 years, it has to be Lenin. Three legacies. The first is the idea of the total control state. The total control state. And this sprang from the very first legislation that came from the Bolshevik seizure of power in November. And that was legislation that put all distribution of food within the capital of Petrograd within the hands of the government. Nobody could get any food unless it had been authorized by the government. And from Petrograd, that then spreads to Moscow, to the other cities, and then to the surrounding areas. And we all know the history, the terrible history that follows from all that. What Lenin understood was that if you want to grab control of people, grab control of their food. Right? The basic lesson that the Bolshevik Revolution put in place from the very beginning. And by 1818 and 1919 had become standard part of government practice by Lenin's regime, was that if you don't obey, you won't eat. And that's a very powerful tool. Especially in a country which, we have to say, as a result of World War I, in which food supplies had broken down and become very difficult to get food, and so the government taking control, in one sense, was justified. On the other hand, it was justified not in ways to give food, but to deny it. To deny it to those who didn't obey, who didn't go along, who didn't become part of the system, part of the government. And this is an important principle, which Lenin has left on and is allowed to continue on. If you control people physically, right, control their destiny physically, it's very, very difficult for them to disobey, break away from the government, whether it's a question of food, whether it's a question of control of their health care, whether it's a control of their livelihood, the welfare state, whatever else we can say about its origins, its good intentions, and so on, it becomes, in a very short period of time, a tool for control, a tool to sort of say, you don't want those payments to stop, do you? You don't want us to cut off the supply of health care, your ability to get those kind of, so you have to go along, you have to become part of the system, and what follows through all this. That's Lenin. That's Lenin and the Bolshevik regime who put that into place and set it up there. The second legacy is the total surveillance state, because you can't have total control if you're not keeping track of what people are doing every single day in every aspects of their lives. Together with control over the food supply and government control over who gets food and who doesn't, one of Lenin's first steps is to create a secret police. The Military Revolutionary Committee, I talk about all this in the book, by the way, when it comes out in November. You're going to read all the details about it. The revolutionary militia that he's used to seize power very quickly becomes a secret police by which to enforce and control what takes place in the country and to make sure, again, in the guise of hunting for traitors, actually hunting for dissenters, anyone who stands in the way of the government and stands in the way of the regime. That's also part of it, too. And the growth of the total surveillance state with its secret police, with its use of informants. I mean, you look at the history of not just the Soviet Union, but also everywhere where the Soviets went in the Iron Curtain, the conversion of a substantial part of the population to becoming informants to the police, right? Which is a way, it's a double win if you're a totalitarian. It's a double win because on the one hand you get to find out everything that's happening because people are constantly informing you on your neighbor or your family members and so on, what they're doing that goes against the views of the regime, right, and what they're supposed to believe. But it also sows the seeds of a distrust that runs and corrupts the whole fabric of society. Because you never know who you're sitting with in a cafe, who you're sitting with on a train, who you're sitting with and you're talking with on Facebook, who's not a police spy, right? You don't know. You don't know. And so you hold it in. You don't say what you really think. You toe the line. You set it up to toe the line. And in a country like, for example, now in Russia, this has, in Putin's Russia, it's reached its culmination in the whole total surveillance system that the regime has set up called SORM. Did anyone know about SORM? I wrote an article about a year and a half ago in commentary about it. SORM is the successors to the KGB. The FSB have created a system in which they are able to not only find out everything that you're saying on the internet and watching on the internet and everything that everyone you're talking to on the telephone or through social media and everything that you're involved with on a daily basis and so on, but they're able to take that information and integrate it with the surveillance cameras that are set up all across the capital, all across Russia to monitor parking lots and workplaces and subways and everything else. So it becomes possible to keep track of what you're doing and what you're doing every single moment of the day. And if you happen to sort of fall within the purview of the government as being a sort of suspicious character, which is actually not that difficult in a regime like Putin's Russia or President Xi's China and so on, you are under surveillance every single second. And we'll keep track of it. Doesn't mean you're in big trouble, right? Doesn't mean you're going to be arrested any second, but it does mean that they know what you're up to. And they sometimes even know what you're up to before you do, right? Right? And that's a total surveillance state. That's your real dream. If you want to be a chief of secret police, which I hope none of you do, but that's the most important role of all, is to have that power to know what others are going to do before they do because of the total surveillance network, the total surveillance system been created. And then the third one, and this is where I'm going to finish up. The third legacy is the total information state. We call it propaganda, but that's not even touching the real issue here. The total information state, that there's only one viewpoint allowed on every issue, on every question. And the regime and all the power of the state is there to reinforce it and to enforce that one single view. It's interesting, when the Soviets came into the Iron Curtain countries after the collapse of the Nazis, right, at the end of World War II, what was the first thing that they did? Well, of course, they brought the secret police, no question. But the second thing that they did was they brought their radio broadcast and radio network and personnel to set up pro-Soviet radio networks in all those countries, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, you name it, because they knew who controls the information controls power. To broadcast constantly a pro-Soviet view, a pro-Soviet worldview to everyone there that would drown out every other point of view, every other view about issues, about life, about existence itself. And of course, when you've got the secret police culling out everybody else who does have that alternate view, this becomes very easy to do, to create such a single monolithic view of life, one dictated by the party, what comes to be called the party line, the party line. But the party line is more than just something you support in public. It's something in which there's no alternative. There's no alternative. And it's a public view which is, in a sense, reinforced by, not just by describing things, but describing things that haven't happened. right? Disinformation. This is disinformation, as we call it. We've run into that now with Putin's Russia. They're masters of this, but the masters of it because they learned it from the Soviet regime. The Soviet regime was built upon disinformation. The very the very coup that Lenin carried out, as I explained in the book, was a coup not against the government, was to protect the Russian people from the government. The idea was that they were about to arrest Lenin and hand over power to the bourgeois and so on, and Lenin and his group had to act to prevent something really terrible happening. Disinformation. It goes back to the very origins of the regime. It extends all the way through Stalin, all the way through the Cold War, and extends down to today's Putin. But what's important to remember when we talk about disinformation and about Putin and his Facebook antics, which are very serious, by the way, don't misunderstand. They're very serious, because at Hudson Institute, we've done a lot of work with a big data analytics company, and you wouldn't believe the tens of thousands of Russian trolls who were interfering with the election. It's no myth. It's no myth. But bear in mind that disinformation and political correctness are two sides of the same coin. The goal is to create one single view of the world from which dissent is not possible, in which dissent is in fact dangerous. It's racist, it's white supremacist, it's whatever else that comes with it, and it's direct with it here. And in which freedom is finally, in the end, what the freedom is left is the freedom to agree with the consensus. The freedom to agree with that one single view that takes place here. Now, this is what I find rather scary about the whole situation, is that Lenin's legacy, which has come to us via the New Left and through tenured radicals — that's a great title for a book, by the way. Someone should write such a book sometime. Is Roger Kimball here? Is he in the room by any chance? That Lenin's legacy here has come now to take fruit and to bear fruit in today's colleges and universities. With the notable exception of Hillsdale, of course, and a few others. And we see it in so many ways, with the emphasis on the PC, the emphasis upon the idea that the language of those who dissent from the one view, right, the one accepted view, constitutes violence and therefore has to be responded to with violence. It's very Lenin. It's straight out of Lenin. It's exactly the approach that Lenin took to these kinds of things. Together with which I have noticed over the last decade has been an increasingly revisionist view of communism itself. A view that really communism, when we look at it in the long historical view, it wasn't really that bad. Certainly no worse than capitalism, right? And probably better in some ways, because after all, its intentions were better. It wanted to, make people's lives better, make them more equal and things like this. Books like Antonio Negri's Empire, which was a bestseller, came out just before 9/11, as a matter of fact. But its impact is there. Its impact is palpable, these kinds of books and this approach to it. And this is what we have to remember and constantly remind ourselves, is that what Lenin, when you look at Lenin, look at his life and his writings and so on, what you see is the raw truth about communism. If I may paraphrase a certain president in his speech at the UN very recently, that what we see when we look at a country like North Korea is not the failure to implement communism, it's the faithful implementation of communism, the final end of it here. And it's important for us, all of us here, to bear that in mind and to look at the young people around you, right? Look at them. It's the fruit of a generation. But remember that each one of them, for all of them, if they're under the age of 30 anyway, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's history. They have no memory. It's something that happened long ago in their minds, from their perspective here. Very important to bear that in mind about this. For the fall of the Berlin Wall was the end of a process. It was the end it was a closure on a certain historical era, on a historical conflict. But for them, it's a part of history. Not much more than that. And if we don't explain the context to them, it will fade into insignificance in the process. There's Anne Applebaum, is a historian, and some of you may know her. She's written books on the Gulag. She's written books on the Iron Curtain. She has a new book she's recently published on Stalin's Great Famine. Really depressing subjects to talk about and discuss. But at a conference once, someone asked her, they said to Anne, she said, you know, you work on all this stuff, you write all these books. Is it because you're worried that someday this will happen again? And she said, no. She said, because I know it will happen again. And it seems to me that in the end, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, is and the responsibility every one of us in this room sitting here carries, is to make sure that her prediction never comes true. I'm done. Thank you. Now, I'm told that the young people with the microphones are going to find the ones asking questions, so I can't play favorites. So I'm just going to sit here and let them pick out the ones who have questions. But I see somebody's arm way up in the back. I can't resist.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Herman.
Thank
Please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you.
What are your comments about the recent revelation about the communist graduating from West Point?
Well, we all have our histories, right? I mean, you don't know what my history was, do you? No. Oh my! I haven't told many people about this, but when I was in 4th grade, I was passing out copies of the Communist Manifesto to my fellow students at Jefferson School in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. I was a thorough radical. I grew up in a very left family. So I know how these histories go and what takes place. I think, though, and don't forget, on the other side, I've also written a biography of Joseph McCarthy, right? Which was, I think a lot of people felt maybe too sympathetic to McCarthy in terms of his views about issues about loyalty, right? The questions of loyalty to one's country, the question about what communism represents as an ideology, but also as the antithesis for what America stands for and what it represents. And I think we've slid very much in the wrong direction with regard to that. And there's a kind of tolerance that communism, you know, it's a period kids go through and things like that, or that history has gone through and we're over it. We're not. We are not. Compared to the threat of neo-communism, I think the threat of neo-Nazism that bedevils the media today is minimal compared to the threat of neo-communism, because it comes in so many pervasive ways. It comes in so many pervasive ways in a way in which extremist ideologies on the right in this country simply cannot gain purchase here. So, when you're 11 years old handing out copies of Communist Manifesto, I think you can forgive that, can't you? You can forgive it. But at West Point, I don't think it's a great thing.
Where does Saul Alinsky fit into your analysis?
Well, where does Saul Alinsky fit into the framework? Well, I mentioned the New Left, and of course I was thinking not only of Saul Alinsky, but also of the whole cohort who came of age in the 1960s, and who translated many of the much of the Leninist program into a program for transforming America. And if they couldn't do it through revolution in the streets, then they would do it through revolution in academia, what comes to be called the long march through the institutions here. But I think what's important, again, from an historical genealogy of ideas point of view, is that who is Saul Alinsky's hero? Who is his role model? It's Lenin. It's not Stalin. The New Left despised Stalin. They hated the old line communists who had, followed the Stalinist line through the Nazi-Soviet pact and even, adhered to it after Khrushchev's secret speech talking about all the terrible things that Stalin had done and had carried out here as well. And so we overlook the fact that Lenin is the culprit here. He's the hateful, awful as Stalin is. Lenin's impact, I think, is more global, frankly, and more important in terms of where we are and what has happened over the last 100 years. His influence is more far-reaching and at least as destructive. That answer your question?
Hi, are you, am I ready?
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for coming to give us this great lecture. My name is Doyle. My question is that had the communists taken the approach of Marx in terms of letting history unfold in implementing communism, do you think they would have ever been successful? Do you think they would still have ever been successful in implementing the dangerous ideology?
It's an interesting kind of an what if. Well, I think they would have been led a very interesting discussion group, up through the 1920s and 1930s. Look, the turn that Lenin took was not just his alone. There was in Russia a number of other Marxist thinkers who likewise, their argument was twofold. One was Marx was wrong. Russia is much more industrialized than he ever realized. And in fact, Lenin's first important published work, which is really his only work of economic analysis, is a study of the growing industrialization of Russia, which really sort of says, hey, we actually are becoming a bourgeois capitalist country. Therefore, by Marx's own standards, we should be ripe for revolution and ready to go. And that was a widely accepted view among other Russian Marxists at the time. I mean, if you're going to be a Marxist, you want to be revolutionary. You don't want to be sort of saying, well get back to me in 50 years and we'll sort of see what's going to happen. Right? Well, if we're ready for revolution yet. That's not how you justify what you're doing. But what Lenin did was to take the next move, and that is that we don't have to wait for a critical mass of working class. That once you've got a professional revolutionary elite who know how to take power and know how to manipulate power, then the working class will come along. And if the working class doesn't, then it's too bad for them. We're doing it for them, and if they don't appreciate it, then it's a bullet in the head. And this is, of course, what in fact happened to them in the process. So the waiting for Marx, waiting for Godot, these are processes that extend out far beyond the horizon. And European socialism had taken that turn under Edward Bernstein. We'll take a slow approach to transformation of Europe into socialism. Right? That was Edward Bernstein. It's one that Lenin excoriated. It's one that he despised. And in many ways, you could argue that his radical activist position that I talk about here was in direct opposition to the Bernstein incrementalist socialist approach that the other European socialist parties had taken. And it becomes the break that comes between mainstream socialist parties and then the communist parties that develop under the Third International. What else?
Given what you've told us, why the antipathy between Lenin and Stalin, especially after that second stroke where he says, whatever you do, don't make him head?
Well, this is a question that requires a tiny little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with the Lenin-Stalin dynamic. Stalin, of course, was a loyal follower from the early days of the revolution, who began to gain more and more power as head of the party and assuming more and more bureaucratic control over the party, especially after Lenin's suffered his assassination attempt and then his first stroke in 1922. I think a lot of his antipathy ran to Stalin had less to do with where Stalin was going to take the party and more about the way in which he felt that Stalin's control was one dedicated not towards advancing revolution, but advancing Stalin. And I think what he saw in Stalin was someone who was not up to the real job that Lenin wanted, which was the ongoing spread of the revolution out beyond beyond Soviet borders. Stalin, in the end, becomes, after all, the man who embraces socialism in one country and who curtails the, if I say, the sort of the zeal with which Lenin saw the war spreading, the way in which class violence and war would spread across Europe. And Stalin was somebody who instinctively rebelled against that view. His view is the view of a bureaucrat from a desk. It's not from a revolutionary with a rifle. He's not Che Guevara, in other words. Che Guevara is the kind of person that Lenin would have wanted. Trotsky would have been a good pick from his point of view, I think. Would have been the ideal pick with it. But Stalin represented the victory of bureaucracy over charisma in his mind, and this is not the way, not the future path for the revolution from Lenin's mind. And in many ways, it was true. And as I mentioned, the embrace of revolution in the Third World, Stalin stays away from that kind of thing. Stalin develops more normal relations and looks to normal relations with Europe, for example, in Western Europe, and sort of brings Russia back into the, I won't say the community of nations, that's absurd, but establishes more sort of normal relations with the other great powers of Europe here. Turns away from the Third World. The man who picks that up, of course, is Khrushchev. Khrushchev is the one who then realizes there's, in the post-colonial world, the post-imperialist world, there's all these opportunities to spread, through national liberation movements, to spread the power of the Soviet Union through the gospel of communism. And so he revised it, including places like Cuba. Lenin would be very much in favor of that kind of an approach. Stalin steers clear from that kind of thing. So Stalin, I think, in many ways you could sort of say is too much of a moderate from Lenin's point of view. If you can believe that,
We now have time for one more question.
Yeah, hi, my name is Conrad. When I was born was pretty much when the wall was going down, and I was fortunate enough when I was younger to live in Berlin, and there's a really fascinating history in that city. I think anyone that's been there can see the scars of what socialism did there. But in our contemporaries, kids, the people my age, if you go to Berlin, they can be standing next to shrapnel scars from World War II, and they have this deep antipathy towards anything that has to do with communism. Like, they don't care whether they're even pro-communists or in some way just reliving the entire revolution again. And one of the things that I fear is like that happening in America, and I think that's something everyone here probably shares. So as someone who's younger and who's dealing with contemporaries who are falling back into these ideas, how would you suggest that we could go about inoculating ourselves and our generation from these ideas taking hold again?
Well, no, I'm not going to sort of say read my book. I think that's too self-serving. I'm not going to go quite that far, although that's actually probably a good idea. That's probably a good idea. But I think also simply having a true and frank accounting of what takes place. With the Holocaust, right, the expression is never forget, and we don't forget. We're constantly reminded. We're constantly looking at and thinking about what happened, the human cost, the ideologies that underlay it, right? And the kinds of crimes, but also the kinds of personalities who were drawn to that terrible, terrible episode in history. And I think we need to keep doing that with Soviet Union as well. And I think one of the ways in which to do it, I just put my finger on it as I think about it, is the issue of personalities. Focus on Stalin, focus on Lenin, focus on Trotsky, who also gets a pass because, he ends up becoming, Stalin's great nemesis and leads a whole series of investigations in committees challenging the truth behind the Moscow trials, which he was right to do and his supporters were right to do. But Trotsky's no better than the other two. I mean, he's even, in some ways, you could say worse here. Or the men who worked with Stalin. All of these figures who are, Kaganovich and Voroshilov and Beria and Molotov and so on. What's important to realize is, and this is sometimes obscured in the way in which we read about them in the history books, but needs to be emphasized, that these guys never lost the faith. One of the reasons they were willing to commit the crimes that they did was because they believed that this was the way in which they were going to create a better society. A better society the way Marx had pointed the direction, the way Lenin had pointed the direction here. These were leftists in power. We have to always remember about these men. Leftists in power with absolute power, and that they exercised it in the name of an ideology, not just personal power, not just for the sake of the greater Russia or whatever kinds of other sorts of motivations or that we can lay at their feet. That the ideological dimension to what the Soviet Union did, even under Stalin here, must never be forgotten, must be constantly emphasized here, so that those who venture into that territory, just as we do with neo-Nazis, right? You see the swastika, you know exactly, there's a history behind that. There's an ideology behind that. Likewise with the hammer and sickle, huh? Don't you think? Likewise with the hammer and sickle. There should be a similar moral equivalence in the minds of those who are engaged in, and that, I think, is a powerful, powerful pedagogical mission that needs to be embarked on in thinking about these events and where they have taken us all in the last 100 years and the price we've all paid for it. You guys have been great. Thank you so much.